What happens when a prince, raised in the luxury of ancient India, steps away from it all to create a revolutionary spiritual path? A path so bold that it challenged the very foundation of the religion he was born into, Hinduism. In this video, we're diving into the radical teachings of the Buddha, teachings that didn't just challenge Hinduism, but forever changed the spiritual landscape of ancient India and the world. How did his teachings upend key Hindu concepts like the self, the caste system, and even the nature of enlightenment itself? Please watch the video until the end, as I reveal how the Buddha impacted Hinduism so much that they incorporated Lord Buddha into their religion. Now let's dive in. Chapter 1. The religious context of ancient India. Let's start by understanding the religious world into which Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was born. Around the 5th century BCE, Hinduism was the dominant spiritual tradition in India. But it wasn't exactly the Hinduism we know today. At that time, it was more accurately called Brahmanism, a faith deeply rooted in the Vedas, the sacred texts that outline the rituals and philosophies of life. The Vedas emphasized rituals, particularly sacrifices, as essential to maintaining cosmic order. This was a religion where Brahmins, the priestly class, held immense power. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, performing complex rituals that were thought to connect humanity with the divine. Society was organized by the caste system, a rigid social hierarchy that determined one's role, duties, and spiritual potential based on birth. In this context, the Brahmins held the highest caste, seen as the only ones capable of achieving spiritual liberation, while the lower castes had to wait for better rebirths before they could even hope for liberation. It was a world of strict social and spiritual boundaries. But despite this structure, there was a growing dissatisfaction among many who questioned the dominance of rituals, the authority of the Brahmins, and the limitations placed on spiritual growth. This is the world into which Siddhartha Gautama was born, a world that would soon be turned upside down by his radical teachings. Chapter 2. The Buddha's radical departure from Hinduism. Siddhartha was born into a royal family, shielded from the harsh realities of life. But when he encountered suffering in the form of old age, sickness, and death, his journey toward enlightenment began. He wasn't satisfied with the answers given by the Brahmins, and this is where his radical departure from Hinduism starts to unfold. The Buddha took several core concepts from Hinduism and turned them on their heads. Let's begin with karma and rebirth. In Hinduism, karma is the law of cause and effect. Your actions in this life determine your future, often tied to your caste. The Buddha didn't reject karma, but he redefined it. In Buddhism, karma is not tied to rituals or caste, but to intentions and ethical conduct. The Buddha taught that it's not just what you do, but why you do it. This shift emphasized personal responsibility over rituals and caste obligations. Then there's the Buddha's radical teaching of anatta, or no self. Hinduism teaches the concept of Atman, the eternal soul that is identical to Brahman, the universal consciousness. The goal in Hinduism is to realize that the self, or Atman, is one with Brahman. This is known as moksha, or liberation. But the Buddha turned this concept on its head. He taught that there is no permanent self, no unchanging Atman. Instead, the self is a collection of ever-changing physical and mental processes. The self is an illusion, and attachment to it is the source of suffering. This idea of anatta, that there is no soul, was one of the Buddha's most radical teachings, directly challenging the core of Hindu philosophy. Chapter 3. The rejection of the caste system. Now, let's talk about one of the Buddha's most socially radical ideas, the rejection of the caste system. At the heart of Hindu society was the belief that one's spiritual journey was largely determined by birth. Brahmins were seen as closer to the divine, while those born into lower castes were considered spiritually inferior. This hierarchy dictated not just social status, but access to religious knowledge and spiritual liberation. The Buddha rejected this entirely. He taught that enlightenment was available to everyone, regardless of caste. In his Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, people from all castes could join. For the first time, individuals from lower castes, who had been denied access to religious texts and rituals, were given the opportunity to pursue spiritual liberation alongside Brahmins. This teaching had profound implications. It challenged not just Hindu religious teachings, but the entire social order. The Buddha's rejection of the caste system made him incredibly popular among lower caste individuals, but it also drew criticism from the Brahmin elite, who saw their spiritual authority being questioned. Chapter 4. The Concept of Nirvana versus Moksha. One of the most significant differences between Hinduism and Buddhism lies in their concepts of liberation. In Hinduism, the ultimate goal is to realize that the individual soul, or Atman, is one with Brahman, the ultimate reality. This realization, known as moksha, frees a person from the cycle of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. But in Buddhism, the goal isn't to realize some eternal self. The Buddha taught that liberation comes through achieving nirvana, the extinguishing of desire, ignorance, and suffering. Nirvana is not a union with the divine, but a state where one transcends the cycle of samsara altogether. It's freedom from craving and attachment, not the realization of an eternal self. While Hinduism seeks the unification of the soul with the divine, Buddhism focuses on the cessation of suffering through the dissolution of the very idea of the self. This redefinition of liberation was groundbreaking and further highlighted the Buddha's break from Hinduism. Chapter 5. The Buddha's Critique of Rituals and Sacrifice. In Hinduism, rituals, especially sacrifices, were seen as essential to maintaining cosmic order and gaining favor from the gods. The yajna, or sacrificial ritual, was performed by Brahmins to honor the gods and ensure prosperity. These rituals were believed to cleanse karma and were central to religious practice. But the Buddha critiqued these rituals, suggesting that they were unnecessary for spiritual progress. Instead of relying on external rituals, the Buddha emphasized internal transformation. He taught that ethical conduct, meditation, and personal insight were the true paths to liberation. This was a radical departure from the ritualistic focus of Hinduism. By de-emphasizing ritual, the Buddha democratized spiritual practice. Anyone could follow the Eightfold Path and achieve enlightenment, regardless of their ability to perform rituals or their caste status. This was a direct challenge to the Brahminical monopoly on spiritual knowledge and practice. Chapter 6. Intellectual Debates with Hindu Philosophers. The Buddha's radical teachings didn't go unnoticed. They sparked intense intellectual debates with Hindu philosophers, particularly those of the Advaita Vedanta school. One of the most famous critics of Buddhism was Shankaracharya, a Hindu philosopher who lived several centuries after the Buddha. Shankaracharya argued that the Buddha's teaching of anatta, no self, was flawed. He believed that the self, or Atman, was indeed real and identical with Brahman. Shankaracharya's critiques of Buddhism were part of a broader philosophical revival of Hinduism that sought to reassert the importance of the Vedas and the concept of the eternal self. These debates weren't just intellectual, they were part of a larger struggle for religious dominance in India. Over time, Hinduism adapted and absorbed many Buddhist ideas, and Buddhism began to decline in India. But these debates had a lasting impact on both traditions. Chapter 7. The Legacy of the Buddha's Radical Teachings. Though Buddhism eventually declined in India, the Buddha's teachings left a lasting legacy. Many of his ideas, such as compassion, meditation, and the importance of personal ethics, were absorbed into Hindu philosophy. In fact, the Buddha himself was later incorporated into Hinduism as an avatar of Vishnu, one of the most important gods in the Hindu pantheon. Today, The Buddha's teachings continue to resonate around the world. His radical rethinking of concepts like the self, karma, and liberation have influenced not just religious thought, but also philosophy, psychology, and even modern mindfulness practices. The Buddha's challenge to Hinduism was not just a rejection of certain ideas, it was the creation of an entirely new spiritual path, a path that has continued to inspire millions for over 2,500 years. The Buddha's teachings weren't just radical, they were revolutionary. By challenging core Hindu concepts like the caste system, the self, and the nature of liberation, he offered an entirely new way of thinking about life, suffering, and enlightenment. His rejection of rituals, caste hierarchy, and the idea of an eternal self set Buddhism apart from the dominant spiritual traditions of his time. Today, both Buddhism and Hinduism continue to thrive, but the Buddha's radical ideas remain as thought-provoking and transformative as ever. So, what do you think? Was the Buddha's intention to reform Hinduism or to create an entirely new spiritual path? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos exploring the wisdom of the world's spiritual traditions.